The Industrial Revolution's smoke-belching factories and soot-covered cities of early 19th century Europe gave birth to more than just mass production and urban sprawl. They birthed a dream of human redemption that would reshape the political landscape for centuries to come. As the first steam engines thundered to life and workers streamed into cramped tenements, a handful of visionary thinkers began to imagine radically different ways of organizing society, laying the philosophical groundwork for what would become one of history's most influential and contentious political movements. Robert Owen stood among the cotton mills of New Lanark, Scotland, in 1805, watching 13-year-old children operate dangerous machinery for 14 hours a day, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of human potential. The Welsh-born manufacturer had inherited a textile operation that epitomized industrial capitalism's harsh realities. But unlike his contemporaries who saw worker exploitation as an inevitable cost of progress, Owen envisioned something entirely different. He believed that human character was formed entirely by environment and circumstances, a radical departure from prevailing notions of fixed social hierarchies and moral failings among the poor. Owen's transformation of New Lanark became the first practical experiment in what would later be called socialism. He reduced working hours, banned child labor under 10 years old, provided education for workers' children, and created company stores that sold goods at cost rather than profit. The results were remarkable: productivity increased, worker health improved, and crime virtually disappeared. Owen had demonstrated that treating workers humanely was not only morally superior but economically viable, challenging the fundamental assumptions of early industrial capitalism. But Owen's ambitions extended far beyond reforming individual factories. In 1825, he purchased 30,000 acres in Indiana to establish New Harmony, a utopian community where private property would be abolished and collective ownership would create a society of equals. The experiment attracted 900 settlers, including scientists, educators, and reformers from across America and Europe. For a brief, shining moment, New Harmony represented the possibility of transcending capitalism entirely, creating a society based on cooperation rather than competition, shared prosperity rather than individual accumulation. The community's collapse within 2 years revealed the challenges that would plague socialist experiments for generations. Without clear leadership structures or economic incentives, productivity declined, factions emerged, and ideological disagreements fractured the community. Owen's assumption that changing external conditions would automatically transform human nature proved overly optimistic. The failure of New Harmony, however, did not diminish Owen's influence. His ideas about worker education, cooperative economics, and the environmental roots of social problems would inspire generations of socialist thinkers. Across the English Channel, Charles Fourier was developing an even more elaborate vision of socialist transformation. The French philosopher spent his days as a traveling salesman, observing the waste and inefficiency of competitive capitalism, and his evenings designing intricate plans for Phalansteries, self-sufficient communities of exactly 1,620 people that would harness human passions for collective benefit rather than individual gain. Fourier believed that all human desires, including those considered anti-social, could be channeled productively through proper social organization. Fourier's psychological insights were remarkably sophisticated for his era. He understood that work became drudgery only when it was monotonous and disconnected from its purpose, proposing that people should rotate between different occupations throughout the day to maintain interest and develop their full potential. His concept of attractive labor suggested that properly organized work could become a source of pleasure rather than suffering, a radical notion in an age when labor was viewed as inherently unpleasant necessity. The phalanstery model attracted international attention, inspiring experimental communities across Europe and America. Brook Farm in Massachusetts, established by transcendentalist intellectuals, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, attempted to implement Fourierist principles among some of America's most educated citizens. Like New Harmony, Brook Farm initially succeeded in creating a vibrant intellectual community where manual and mental labor were equally valued, but economic pressures and internal disagreements eventually led to its dissolution. Meanwhile, Claude-Henri de Rouvroy, Comte de Saint-Simon, was developing yet another approach to socialist transformation. Unlike Owen's focus on small communities or Fourier's detailed social blueprints, Saint-Simon envisioned socialism as the inevitable next stage of human development, emerging naturally from industrial society's growing complexity and interdependence. The French aristocrat turned philosopher argued that industrial progress required rational planning and scientific management, which could only be achieved by replacing the chaos of market competition with conscious social coordination. Saint-Simon's technocratic vision of socialism emphasized the role of scientists, engineers, and industrial leaders in creating a rationally organized society. He coined the phrase, "From each according to his ability to each according to his work," which would later be adapted by Karl Marx into one of socialism's most famous formulations. Saint-Simon believed that industrial development would naturally lead to the elimination of idle classes, both the traditional aristocracy and the financial speculators, who contributed nothing to production, creating a society governed by those who actually created wealth. The Saint-Simonian movement attracted brilliant disciples who spread the master's ideas throughout Europe and beyond. Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin and Armand Bazard developed Saint-Simon's insights into a comprehensive social theory that influenced railroad development, banking systems, and even the construction of the Suez Canal. Saint-Simonian engineers and economists played crucial roles in modernizing infrastructure across Europe, demonstrating how socialist ideas could have practical impact even without revolutionary political change. These early socialist thinkers shared certain fundamental assumptions that distinguished them from both conservative defenders of traditional hierarchies and liberal advocates of unrestricted capitalism. They believed that human nature was essentially cooperative rather than competitive, that social problems stemmed from bad institutions rather than individual moral failings, and that rational reorganization of society could eliminate poverty, conflict, and human suffering. Their optimism about human potential and their faith in social engineering would profoundly influence all subsequent socialist movements. The 1830s and 1840s witnessed an explosion of socialist experimentation and theorizing as economic crises and social upheavals demonstrated capitalism's instability and injustice. The development of industrial technology had created unprecedented productive capacity, yet millions lived in desperate poverty, while a small elite accumulated vast wealth. The contradiction between potential abundance and actual scarcity convinced growing numbers of intellectuals and workers that fundamental system change was necessary rather than mere reform. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon emerged as perhaps the most influential socialist theorist of this period, coining the famous declaration, "Property is theft," while developing a sophisticated critique of both capitalism and centralized state socialism. The French printer and journalist argued that private ownership of productive resources inevitably led to exploitation, as property owners could extract surplus value from workers who had no choice but to sell their labor. Proudhon's mutualism proposed replacing both private property and state control with a system of cooperative ownership and voluntary association. Proudhon's emphasis on decentralization and voluntary cooperation influenced the development of anarchist thought, but his immediate impact was on the growing European labor movement. Workers struggling against industrial capitalism found in Proudhon's writings a theoretical framework that validated their experiences while pointing toward practical alternatives. The idea that workers could organize their own cooperative enterprises without depending on either capitalist employers or government assistance provided hope for immediate improvement within the existing system. As the 1840s progressed, economic crisis and political upheaval created conditions for revolutionary change across Europe. The Irish potato famine, industrial depression, and harvest failures produced mass suffering that exposed the inadequacy of existing social arrangements. In this context of the mounting crisis, two young German intellectuals began developing a new synthesis of socialist theory that would transform the movement from utopian dreaming into scientific analysis and revolutionary practice. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels met in Paris in 1844 and began a collaboration that would reshape understanding of capitalism, class struggle, and historical development for generations to come. Karl Marx, 26 years old and already exiled from his native Prussia for his radical journalism, encountered the gritty reality of industrial capitalism during his 1844 sojourn in Paris, where smoking factory chimneys cast perpetual shadows over neighborhoods where entire families crowded into single rooms. The young philosopher had arrived in the City of Light with a head full of German idealism and a doctorate in ancient philosophy. But the sight of French workers laboring 16-hour days for subsistence wages while factory owners accumulated unprecedented wealth transformed his abstract interest in social justice into a burning commitment to revolutionary change. Friedrich Engels, 2 years younger than Marx and heir to a Manchester textile fortune, had spent the previous 2 years documenting the horrific conditions of English industrial workers, producing a devastating account that would become the condition of the working class in England. Engels possessed what Marx lacked: intimate knowledge of capitalist production from the inside, combined with first-hand observation of how the industrial system degraded human beings into mere appendages of machines. When the two men met in a Parisian cafe, their intellectual chemistry was immediate and explosive, creating a partnership that would forge socialism into a scientific analysis of historical development rather than merely utopian dreaming. Marx brought to their collaboration a profound understanding of German philosophy, particularly Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's dialectical method, which viewed history as a process of contradictions generating higher levels of development through conflict and resolution. Engels contributed practical knowledge of economics and industrial organization, plus a talent for clear exposition that could make Marx's often dense theoretical insights accessible to working-class audiences. Together, they began developing what they called scientific socialism, a systematic analysis of capitalism's internal contradictions that would inevitably lead to its overthrow and replacement by a classless society. Their first major collaboration, The Holy Family, published in 1845, demolished the abstract philosophizing of their German contemporaries while developing a materialist understanding of historical change that located social transformation in real economic relationships rather than changes in consciousness or ideas. Marx and Engels argued that the material conditions of life, how people produced food, shelter, and other necessities, determined social relationships, political institutions, and even dominant ideas, reversing the traditional emphasis on ideas shaping material conditions. This materialist conception of history became the foundation for their analysis of capitalism as a historically specific system that had emerged from feudalism through definite economic processes and would eventually be superseded by socialism through similar material developments. Unlike earlier socialist thinkers who based their critiques on moral outrage or utopian visions, Marx and Engels grounded their analysis in careful study of capitalist economics, showing how the system's own internal logic created the conditions for its eventual overthrow. Marx's intensive study of classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo revealed what he considered capitalism's fundamental contradiction. While individual capitalists pursued profit through competition, their collective actions created systemic crises of overproduction and unemployment that periodically devastated the economy. The drive to maximize profits led capitalists to increase productivity through technological innovation, but this same process reduced the number of workers needed for production, creating what Marx called the reserve army of the unemployed that kept wages low while limiting the market for capitalist goods. The development of Marx's labor theory of value provided the theoretical foundation for understanding capitalist exploitation in scientific, rather than merely moral terms. Marx demonstrated that capitalists' profits came from appropriating the surplus value created by workers who produced more value during their working day than they received in wages. This analysis showed that exploitation was not an accidental feature of capitalism that could be reformed away, but rather the essential mechanism through which the system operated and accumulated wealth. Engels, The Principles of Communism, written in 1847 as a draft for what would become the Communist Manifesto, outlined the practical implications of their theoretical analysis. The pamphlet explained how large-scale industrial production had created a new class of propertyless workers, the proletariat, whose interests were fundamentally opposed to those of the capitalist class that owned the means of production. Unlike earlier socialist thinkers who appealed to universal human nature or moral principles, Marx and Engels located the driving force for socialist transformation in the specific material interests of the industrial working class. The Communist League, a small international organization of German émigré workers and intellectuals, commissioned Marx and Engels to write a manifesto explaining their position for the broader European working class movement. The resulting document, published in February 1848, just as revolutionary upheavals were erupting across Europe, distilled their theoretical analysis into a powerful call for working-class revolution that would resonate through the centuries. The Communist Manifesto opened with the famous declaration that a spectre is haunting Europe, spectre of communism, immediately establishing that the ideas Marx and Engels were articulating represented a real force in European politics rather than merely abstract theorizing. The manifesto's analysis of history as the history of class struggles provided a framework for understanding all previous social developments as conflicts between opposing economic classes, with the current struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat representing the final confrontation that would end class society altogether. The manifesto's description of capitalism's revolutionary impact on traditional society was remarkably prescient, anticipating globalization, technological disruption, and cultural transformation that would unfold over the following century and a half. Marx and Engels understood that capitalism was destroying traditional relationships and customs, creating a world market that reduced all human relationships to cash transactions, but they argued that this destructive process was simultaneously creating the material and social conditions necessary for a higher form of social organization. Their analysis of the bourgeoisie as a historically progressive class that had shattered feudal constraints and developed productive forces beyond anything previously imagined demonstrated that Marx and Engels were not romantic opponents of modernity, but rather critics who wanted to push capitalist development to its logical conclusion. They argued that capitalism had socialized production through large-scale industry and global markets, making private ownership of productive resources increasingly anachronistic and destructive. The manifesto's 10-point program for communist revolution included demands that seemed radical in 1848, but would later be adopted by many capitalist countries. Progressive taxation, free public education, central banking, and government ownership of transportation and communication systems. This practical program demonstrated that Marx and Engels envisioned socialism not as a return to pre-industrial society, but as the fulfillment of industrial development's social potential. The publication of the Communist Manifesto coincided with revolutionary upheavals across Europe as workers and liberal bourgeoisie united against autocratic governments in France, Germany, Austria, and other countries. Marx and Engels returned to Germany to participate directly in the revolutionary movement, editing a radical newspaper and organizing workers in the Rhineland. The experience of actual revolutionary struggle taught them important lessons about the relationship between theory and practice that would influence their later work. The defeat of the 1848 revolutions forced Marx and Engels into London exile, where they would spend the remainder of their lives developing their theoretical analysis while maintaining connections with international working-class movements. The failure of the revolutions convinced them that successful socialist transformation would require longer periods of preparation and more sophisticated understanding of capitalist development, than they had previously assumed. Marx's decades of research in the British Museum reading room, supported by Engels' financial assistance from his family's textile business, produced Das Kapital, a massive analysis of capitalist economics that provided a detailed scientific foundation for the insights sketched in the Communist Manifesto. The first volume, published in 1867, demonstrated how capitalist production created the material conditions for its own supersession through the concentration of capital, the socialization of labor, and the development of working-class consciousness. Engels' role as Marx's closest collaborator and interpreter became crucial for disseminating their ideas to the broader socialist movement that was emerging across Europe in the second half of the 19th century. His popular writings like Socialism, Utopian and Scientific made Marx's complex theoretical analysis accessible to working-class audiences while maintaining the scientific rigor that distinguished their approach from earlier socialist traditions. The influence of Marx and Engels extended far beyond their immediate theoretical contributions, as their scientific socialism provided the intellectual framework for mass working-class political parties that would reshape European politics in the final decades of the 19th century. The sound of Prussian artillery echoing through the streets of Paris in January 1871 created more than just physical devastation. It forged the crucible in which socialist theory would be tested by the harsh realities of revolutionary practice. The Franco-Prussian War had exposed the incompetence and corruption of Napoleon III's Second Empire, leading to military collapse and the emperor's capture at Sedan. But the newly proclaimed Third Republic's leaders proved more concerned with preserving their own power than defending French national honor against the occupying German forces. Adolphe Thiers, the 73-year-old conservative politician who headed the provisional government, faced an impossible situation as he negotiated France's surrender while Prussian forces surrounded the capital. The humiliating terms imposed by Otto von Bismarck, massive indemnities, territorial losses, and a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées inflamed Parisian patriotic sentiment, but Thiers was more frightened by the armed workers of the National Guard than by continued resistance against the Prussians. The National Guard had been expanded during the siege to include virtually all able-bodied Parisian men, creating a citizen militia of 200,000 workers, artisans, and petits bourgeois who had endured months of starvation and bombardment while the wealthy fled to safety in the countryside. These guardsmen had purchased their own rifles and cannons through popular subscription, creating an independent military force that owed no allegiance to the established authorities and had developed democratic traditions through their neighborhood assemblies and elected officers. When Thiers attempted to disarm the National Guard by seizing their cannons from Montmartre on March 18, 1871, the operation backfired spectacularly as government troops fraternized with the guardsmen and angry crowds of working-class women surrounded the soldiers. Two generals, Claude Lecomte and Jacques Clément Thomas, were executed by their own men after ordering them to fire on civilians, while Thiers and his government fled to Versailles, abandoning Paris to the insurgent population. The vacuum of legitimate authority created by the government's flight forced the National Guard Central Committee to assume responsibility for maintaining order and organizing elections for a new municipal government. Unlike previous revolutionary upheavals that had been led by small groups of conspirators or bourgeois politicians, the Paris Commune emerged from genuine popular initiative as working-class neighborhoods organized themselves democratically to create an alternative form of government. The Commune elections of March 26th produced a council of 92 members representing every district of Paris, with a majority drawn from the working class and lower middle class, rather than the professional politicians and wealthy notables who had traditionally dominated French politics. The elected communards included skilled artisans, small shopkeepers, journalists, teachers, and a significant number of socialists influenced by the ideas of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and the First International that Marx and Engels had helped organize. The political program implemented by the Paris Commune during its 72-day existence represented the first practical attempt to apply socialist principles to actual governance, providing invaluable lessons about the possibilities and limitations of working-class political power. The Commune abolished the standing army and police force, replacing them with the citizen militia of the National Guard, while implementing the principle that all public officials should be elected and subject to immediate recall by their constituents. The economic measures adopted by the Commune reflected its working-class constituencies' immediate needs and long-term socialist aspirations, though the brief duration of the experiment limited the scope of what could be accomplished. The Commune decreed that abandoned workshops should be turned over to workers' cooperatives, abolished night work for bakers, and established maximum salaries for government officials equivalent to workers' wages, demonstrating that public service was a civic duty rather than a path to personal enrichment. Religious policy became one of the Commune's most controversial innovations, as the predominantly secular government separated church and state, ending religious instruction in public schools and confiscating church property for public use. These measures reflected both the anti-clericalism common among French workers and the Commune's commitment to rational, scientific approaches to social organization that challenged traditional authority in all its forms. The position of women in Commune society revealed both the progressive potential and the limitations of 19th century socialism, as women participated actively in defending the revolution while being excluded from formal political roles. The Union des Femmes, led by Elizabeth Dmitrieff and Nathalie Lemel, organized women's political participation and advocated for equal pay and educational opportunities, pushing the boundaries of what male communards considered appropriate female involvement in public life. International reaction to the Paris Commune reflected the fear that socialist revolution inspired among established governments across Europe, as conservative leaders recognized that the French experiment could inspire similar upheavals among their own working populations. Bismarck facilitated cooperation between the Thiers government and the German military to suppress the Commune, demonstrating that national rivalries would be subordinated to class interests when bourgeois power was threatened. The violent suppression of the Commune during the Bloody Week of May 21st through 28th, 1871, shocked the international socialist movement with its systematic brutality as Versailles troops executed thousands of prisoners and civilians in an orgy of class revenge. Government forces killed an estimated 20,000 Parisians during the reconquest of the city, while tens of thousands more were imprisoned, exiled, or transported to penal colonies in New Caledonia. Karl Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune in The Civil War in France provided the theoretical framework that would influence all subsequent understanding of the event's historical significance for the socialist movement. Marx argued that the Commune had demonstrated the necessity of smashing the existing state apparatus rather than simply taking control of it, as the bureaucratic and military machinery of bourgeois government was inherently designed to maintain class oppression and could not be reformed for socialist purposes. The Commune's democratic innovation selected officials, immediate recall, rotation of administrative duties, and the principle that representatives should receive workers' wages became central features of Marx's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transitional form of government that would wither away as class distinctions disappeared. These practical lessons from revolutionary experience corrected earlier assumptions that socialist transformation could be achieved simply through winning elections within existing political systems. The international impact of the Commune extended far beyond its immediate influence on socialist theory, as the event became a powerful symbol of working-class heroism and sacrifice that inspired generations of revolutionaries, while terrifying conservative governments into implementing repressive measures against socialist organizations. The massacre of the communards created martyrs whose memory would motivate future revolutionary movements, while the practical innovations of commune governance provided a model for democratic socialism that influenced movements from the Russian Revolution to contemporary worker cooperatives. The suppression of the Paris Commune marked the end of the First International as an effective organization, as governments across Europe used the event as justification for massive repression against socialist and anarchist groups. Marx and Engels spent the following years rebuilding international socialist connections while developing their theoretical analysis based on lessons learned from the Commune's brief but significant experiment in working-class government. The 1870s and 1880s witnessed the emergence of mass socialist political parties across Europe as industrial development created larger working-class populations with shared interests in challenging capitalist exploitation. The German Social Democratic Party, founded in 1875 through the merger of followers of Ferdinand Lassalle and Marx's supporters, became the model for socialist parties that combined parliamentary activity with mass organization and revolutionary goals. August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, the SPD's leading figures, developed strategies for building working-class political power through legal means while maintaining commitment to eventual revolutionary transformation, creating a template that would be adopted by socialist parties throughout Europe and beyond. The party's rapid growth from fewer than 10,000 members in 1875 to over 1 million by 1910 demonstrated the appeal of socialist ideas among industrial workers who experienced capitalism's contradictions daily. Otto von Bismarck's attempt to destroy the German socialist movement through the anti-socialist laws of 1878 only strengthened party solidarity and popular support, as repression drove the movement underground, while failing to address the economic conditions that generated working-class discontent. The SPD's survival and continued growth under illegal conditions proved that socialist ideas had taken deep root among German workers and could not be eliminated through government persecution alone. Similar patterns of socialist party development occurred across Europe as industrialization created working-class constituencies receptive to Marxist analysis and organization, setting the stage for the ideological battles that would define 20th century politics. The massive red banners that filled the streets of Stuttgart in August 1907 during the Second International's Congress carried more than just socialist slogans. They bore the weight of a movement grappling with fundamental questions about revolution, reform, and the path to working-class liberation that would ultimately tear apart the unity Marx and Engels had envisioned. Delegates from 25 countries representing millions of organized workers debated whether socialism could be achieved through parliamentary democracy or required violent overthrow of the capitalist state, a dispute that reflected deeper tensions about the nature of socialist transformation in an era of expanding democratic rights and imperial competition. Eduard Bernstein, the German Social Democratic Party's leading theorist after Engels' death in 1895, had spent his London exile studying British trade union development and liberal democratic institutions, leading him to conclude that Marx's predictions about capitalism's inevitable collapse were proving incorrect. Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism, published in 1899, argued that the working class was gradually improving its conditions through trade union organization and electoral participation, making revolutionary upheaval both unnecessary and counterproductive for achieving socialist goals. Bernstein's revisionist analysis challenged core Marxist assumptions by demonstrating that capitalism was proving more adaptable and resilient than Marx had anticipated, with living standards rising for many workers rather than declining toward absolute immiseration. The expansion of democratic voting rights, the growth of trade unions, and the emergence of social welfare legislation suggested that fundamental change could be achieved through gradual reform rather than revolutionary confrontation with the bourgeois state. The revisionist controversy split the international socialist movement between those who maintained orthodox Marxist positions about the necessity of revolution and those who embraced democratic socialism as a more realistic and humane path to working-class emancipation. Karl Kautsky, the SPD's chief theorist and editor of its journal, Die Neue Zeit, initially defended Marxist orthodoxy against Bernstein's challenges, while developing what became known as centrist positions that combined revolutionary rhetoric with reformist practice. Rosa Luxemburg, the brilliant Polish-born revolutionary who had earned her doctorate at 26 and become one of the SPD's most effective speakers, emerged as Bernstein's most formidable critic through her pamphlet Reform or Revolution, which argued that parliamentary activity could never achieve socialist transformation because the capitalist state would use violence to prevent any fundamental challenge to property relations. Luxemburg maintained that reforms might improve workers' immediate conditions, but would ultimately strengthen capitalism by reducing revolutionary pressures while leaving the basic structure of exploitation intact. The practical implications of these theoretical debates became apparent as European socialist parties grew into mass organizations with millions of members, trade union affiliations, and elected representatives in national parliaments. The German SPD's electoral success, winning over 4 million votes and becoming the largest party in the Reichstag by 1912, demonstrated the potential of democratic socialism, while raising questions about whether such success would moderate the party's revolutionary commitment. Jean Jaurès, the charismatic leader of French socialism, exemplified the democratic socialist approach through his ability to combine parliamentary effectiveness with passionate advocacy for working-class interests and international peace. Jaurès had begun his political career as a moderate Republican, but moved steadily leftward as he witnessed the brutality of capitalist exploitation and the limitations of liberal democracy for addressing structural inequalities that condemned millions to poverty amid unprecedented productive capacity. The Dreyfus Affair, which divided French society over the false conviction of a Jewish army officer for treason, crystallized debates within international socialism about whether socialists should participate in bourgeois politics or maintain revolutionary purity through opposition to all capitalist institutions. Jaurès's decision to support the Republican defense of democratic principles against reactionary forces earned him criticism from orthodox Marxists who argued that all bourgeois political conflicts were irrelevant to working class interests. The formation of the Labour Party in Britain in 1900 provided another model for democratic socialism, as trade unions and socialist societies created an independent political organisation to represent working class interests in Parliament without committing to revolutionary overthrow of the existing system. The party's gradualist approach, influenced by Fabian Society intellectuals like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, emphasized practical reforms and empirical research rather than theoretical purity or ideological confrontation. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known by his revolutionary pseudonym Lenin, was developing a fundamentally different approach to socialist organization from his exile in Switzerland, drawing on his experience of autocratic repression in Russia, where democratic rights were virtually non-existent and revolutionary action seemed the only viable path to political change. Lenin's What Is to Be Done, published in 1902, argued that spontaneous working-class activity would never develop beyond trade union consciousness without guidance from a disciplined party of professional revolutionaries. Lenin's conception of the Revolutionary Party challenged prevailing assumptions about democratic socialism by arguing that the working class required leadership from intellectuals who understood Marxist theory and could develop strategies for overthrowing the capitalist state. This vanguard party model reflected Russian conditions where open political activity was impossible, but Lenin argued that similar organizations were necessary everywhere because the bourgeoisie would never peacefully surrender its power, regardless of electoral outcomes. The 1905 Russian Revolution provided the first major test of different socialist strategies as workers across the Russian Empire engaged in strikes, demonstrations, and armed resistance against Tsarist autocracy following the military disasters of the Russo-Japanese War. The emergence of workers' councils, or Soviets, in St. Petersburg and other cities demonstrated the potential for direct democratic organization that bypassed both capitalist institutions and traditional political parties. Leon Trotsky, a 26-year-old revolutionary who became chairman of the St. Petersburg Soviet, developed his theory of permanent revolution based on the 1905 experience, arguing that socialist revolution in backward countries like Russia would need to spread internationally to survive because isolated revolutionary governments would be crushed by more advanced capitalist powers. This analysis challenged orthodox Marxist assumptions about the stages of historical development by suggesting that socialist revolution could succeed in pre-industrial societies if it became part of a global revolutionary process. The brutal suppression of the 1905 revolution convinced many Russian revolutionaries that peaceful methods were inadequate for overthrowing Tsarism, strengthening support for Lenin's emphasis on illegal organization and armed struggle. The period of reaction that followed saw thousands of revolutionaries executed, imprisoned, or exiled, while Pyotr Stolypin's agrarian reforms attempted to create a conservative peasant class that would support the existing order. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 created the greatest crisis in the history of international socialism as the major European socialist parties abandoned their commitments to international solidarity, supported their respective governments' war efforts. The collapse of the Second International's anti-war resolutions revealed that national loyalties and patriotic emotions were stronger than class consciousness among many socialist voters and leaders. The assassination of Jean Jaurès on July 31, 1914, by a French nationalist fanatic, eliminated the most prominent advocate of international peace and socialist unity just as the crisis was reaching its climax. Jaurès had spent his final weeks desperately trying to organize international socialist opposition to the coming war, but his death symbolized the failure of democratic socialism to prevent the catastrophe that would devastate European civilization. The SPD's decision to vote for war credits in the German Reichstag on August 4th shocked socialists worldwide and seemed to vindicate Lenin's argument that parliamentary socialism was inherently reformist and nationalist, rather than revolutionary and internationalist. Only a small minority of German socialists, including Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, maintained their opposition to the war, forming the nucleus of what would become the Spartacus League and eventually the German Communist Party. The war's devastating impact on European society created conditions for revolutionary upheaval that would test all previous theories about socialist transformation, as military casualties, economic disruption, and popular disillusionment with established authorities opened possibilities for fundamental change that had seemed impossible during the peaceful decades before 1914. The stage was set for the most significant revolutionary experiment in human history, as Russia's military defeats and social collapse created the opportunity for Lenin's small band of professional revolutionaries to seize power and attempt to build the world's first socialist state. The train that carried Vladimir Lenin across Germany in a sealed railway car during April 1917 bore more than just a 47-year-old exile returning to his homeland after 12 years abroad. It carried the theoretical and organizational tools that would transform the most backward major European power into the world's first socialist state within 8 months of his arrival in Petrograd. The German government's decision to facilitate Lenin's return reflected their calculation that his revolutionary activities would further destabilize Russia and eliminate their Eastern Front. But they could hardly have imagined that they were enabling an event that would reshape global politics for the remainder of the 20th century. Russia in early 1917 presented a unique combination of revolutionary opportunity and theoretical challenge that would test every assumption about socialist transformation developed during the previous 70 years of Marxist analysis. The February Revolution had overthrown Tsar Nicholas II with surprising ease, as military mutinies and popular demonstrations in Petrograd forced the autocracy's collapse without significant resistance. But the provisional government that emerged under Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky proved incapable of addressing the fundamental problems that had generated revolutionary discontent. The dual power situation that developed between the provisional government and the workers' and soldiers' councils created unprecedented conditions for revolutionary action, as legitimate authority was divided between competing institutions representing different class interests and political programs. The Soviets, which had emerged spontaneously in factories and military units across the Russian Empire, exercised real power over their constituents, while the provisional government possessed formal legal authority but lacked the capacity to enforce its decisions. Lenin's April theses, delivered immediately upon his return to Russia, shocked even his fellow Bolsheviks with their radical departure from orthodox Marxist expectations about revolutionary development in backward countries. Lenin argued that Russia could proceed directly to socialist revolution without passing through an extended period of bourgeois democratic development, provided the revolution spread to more advanced European countries where the material conditions for socialism actually existed. The theoretical audacity of Lenin's position became apparent when compared to the analysis offered by other Marxist leaders, including many prominent Bolsheviks who assumed that Russia's economic backwardness made immediate socialist transformation impossible. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, Lenin's longtime collaborators, initially opposed his revolutionary strategy as premature and doomed to failure, while the Menshevik faction led by Julius Martov argued that socialists should support the provisional government's efforts to consolidate democratic institutions. Lenin's genius lay in recognizing that the specific conditions created by World War I had fundamentally altered the possibilities for revolutionary action, as the unprecedented scale of social and economic disruption had weakened all existing institutions while creating popular demands for immediate and radical change that no moderate government could satisfy. The war's devastating impact on Russian society, millions of military casualties, economic collapse, and widespread food shortages had delegitimized the entire existing order and created mass support for revolutionary alternatives. The Bolshevik Party's growth from fewer than 25,000 members in February to over 200,000 by October reflected Lenin's success in adapting Marxist analysis to Russian conditions while developing practical strategies for seizing and maintaining power. The party's emphasis on professional organization, ideological clarity, and tactical flexibility proved superior to the loose coalitions and democratic procedures favored by other socialist factions when rapid decision-making and coordinated action became essential for revolutionary success. Leon Trotsky's return to Russia in May and his subsequent alliance with Lenin added crucial theoretical sophistication and organizational talent to the Bolshevik leadership, as Trotsky brought his understanding of permanent revolution and his experience from the 1905 uprising. Trotsky's analysis that socialist revolution in Russia would need to spread internationally to survive provided the theoretical framework that justified immediate revolutionary action despite Russia's economic backwardness. The failed July uprising and Kornilov coup attempt in August demonstrated both the fragility of the provisional government's position and the Bolsheviks' growing influence among workers and soldiers who had lost confidence in moderate solutions to Russia's mounting crises. Lenin's tactical retreat during the July days showed his understanding that revolutionary timing was crucial, while his underground organizing during the summer months prepared the party for the decisive moment when conditions became favorable for armed insurrection. The Bolshevik seizure of power during the October Revolution represented one of the most carefully planned and efficiently executed political takeovers in modern history, as Lenin's strategy of capturing key points in Petrograd while the provisional government remained paralyzed proved devastatingly effective. The revolution's success depended not just on Bolshevik organization, but on the provisional government's complete loss of popular support and the military's unwillingness to defend a regime that had continued the disastrous war while failing to address land reform and workers' demands. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets' endorsement of the Bolshevik action provided democratic legitimacy for the new government, while Lenin's immediate decrees on peace, land, and workers' control addressed the popular demands that had driven the revolutionary process throughout 1917. The land decrees promised to transfer noble and church estates to peasant communes, fulfilled centuries-old peasant aspirations, while the peace decrees call for immediate negotiations to end the war resonated with soldiers and workers who had borne the conflict's heaviest costs. Lenin's adaptation of Marxist theory to justify Bolshevik rule in a backward peasant country required significant theoretical innovation, as he argued that the party could use state power to accelerate Russia's economic development while preparing for international revolution that would ultimately validate their premature seizure of power. This analysis departed significantly from Marx's assumption that socialist revolution would emerge from the contradictions of advanced capitalism rather than being imposed through political action in pre-industrial societies. The establishment of the Cheka secret police under Felix Dzerzhinsky in December 1917 revealed the darker implications of Lenin's revolutionary strategy, as maintaining Bolshevik power required systematic suppression of political opposition and resistance from social groups that opposed socialist transformation. The institutionalization of revolutionary terror as a governing tool marked a fundamental departure from democratic socialist traditions that had emphasized persuasion and electoral competition rather than coercion and violence. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918 eliminated the last vestige of democratic legitimacy for the Bolshevik government, as Lenin argued that Soviet democracy represented a higher form of popular rule than parliamentary institutions that could be manipulated by bourgeois politicians. This decision revealed the tension between Lenin's commitment to working-class power and his rejection of democratic procedures when they threatened Bolshevik control. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918 after agonizing internal debates, demonstrated Lenin's willingness to sacrifice ideological purity for practical necessity, as he accepted devastating territorial losses and reparations to secure peace with Germany, while the new regime consolidated its domestic position. The treaty's harsh terms shocked many Bolsheviks who had expected revolutionary war to spread the revolution internationally. But Lenin understood that survival of the world's first socialist state required tactical compromises that preserved the possibility of future revolutionary advance. The outbreak of civil war in spring 1918 tested every aspect of Lenin's revolutionary strategy, as the new regime faced simultaneous military challenges from white armies led by former Tsarist officers, foreign intervention by capitalist powers determined to strangle Bolshevism at birth, and internal resistance from peasants and workers who opposed war communism's harsh requisition policies and industrial militarization. Trotsky's transformation from revolutionary theorist to military organizer during his leadership of the Red Army demonstrated the Bolsheviks' remarkable adaptability under extreme pressure, as he created an effective fighting force from the remnants of the old army while maintaining political control through commissar system that balanced military expertise with ideological reliability. The Red Army's ultimate victory in the Civil War validated Lenin's analysis that disciplined revolutionary organization could overcome apparently superior forces when it possessed clear political goals and popular support in key sectors of society. The introduction of the new economic policy in 1921 marked Lenin's final major theoretical adaptation, as he acknowledged that immediate transition to socialism was impossible in Russia's devastated condition, and that limited capitalist development was necessary to restore economic production and maintain popular support for Bolshevik rule. The massive steel mills rising from the frozen steppe of Magnitogorsk in the early 1930s represented more than just industrial construction. They embodied Joseph Stalin's vision of socialism as rapid modernization, imposed from above through centralized planning and mass mobilization that would transform the Soviet Union from a backward peasant society into a modern industrial power capable of defending itself against capitalist encirclement. The human cost of this transformation would prove staggering, as millions of peasants died in famines caused by forced collectivization, while millions more labored in harsh conditions to build the infrastructure of what Stalin called socialism in one country. Lenin's death in January 1924 created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter the character of the Soviet experiment. As the struggle between different conceptions of socialist development became intertwined with personal ambitions and factional conflicts within the Bolshevik party leadership. Stalin, who had served as General Secretary since 1922 and controlled the party apparatus that Lenin's testament had warned against, gradually outmaneuvered more prominent rivals through bureaucratic manipulation and tactical alliances that exploited ideological differences about the pace and direction of socialist construction. The defeat of Leon Trotsky, who advocated permanent revolution and international revolutionary strategy, marked a decisive turning point towards Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country, which argued that the Soviet Union could build a complete socialist society regardless of developments in other countries. This theoretical innovation provided ideological justification for policies that prioritized Soviet national interests over international revolutionary goals, fundamentally altering the relationship between the world's first socialist state and communist movements in other countries. Stalin's consolidation of power coincided with the end of the new economic policy and the launch of the first five-year plan in 1928, which set impossibly ambitious targets for industrial production while initiating the forced collectivization of agriculture that would eliminate the independent peasantry as a social class. The plan represented a return to the militarized approach of war communism, but on a much larger scale and with more systematic organization aimed at permanently transforming Soviet society's economic foundation. The collectivization campaign that began in earnest in 1929 constituted one of the most radical social transformations in human history, as party cadres and urban activists descended on villages throughout the Soviet Union to force peasants into collective farms while liquidating the kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants who were blamed for agricultural problems and resistance to socialist policies. The campaign's violence and chaos reflected both the regime's determination to eliminate private property in agriculture and its fundamental misunderstanding of rural conditions and peasant psychology. The human disaster that resulted from forced collectivization demonstrated the gap between socialist theory and the brutal realities of rapid social transformation, as peasant resistance led to livestock slaughter, grain hoarding, and open rebellion that the regime suppressed through deportations, executions, and artificial famine. The Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, known as the Holodomor, killed millions of peasants through policies that deliberately withheld food relief while continuing grain exports to fund industrial imports. The simultaneous industrialization drive mobilized unprecedented resources for building heavy industry, creating entirely new cities and industrial complexes, while training millions of workers in modern production techniques. The Soviet Union's industrial growth during the 1930s was genuinely impressive, as steel production increased from 4 million tons in 1928 to 18 million tons in 1940, while similar advances occurred in coal, oil, and machine production that transformed the country's economic structure. The Stakhanovite movement, named after coal miner Alexei Stakhanov, who allegedly cut 14 times his quota in August 1935, exemplified Stalin's approach to motivating workers through individual heroism and socialist competition, rather than material incentives or democratic participation in workplace decision-making. The movement created new hierarchies and inequalities within the working class, while generating propaganda that portrayed exceptional individual performance as typical of socialist labor. The political terror that reached its peak during the Great Purges of 1936 to 1938 revealed the extent to which Stalin's version of socialism depended on coercion and fear, rather than popular enthusiasm or democratic participation, as show trials, mass arrests, and executions eliminated millions of party members, government officials, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of counter-revolutionary activities. The purges demonstrated that Stalin's regime viewed any independent thinking or organizational loyalty outside the party as potentially treasonous. The elimination of the old Bolsheviks who had made the October Revolution marked the complete transformation of the Soviet system from Lenin's revolutionary vanguard into Stalin's bureaucratic dictatorship, as virtually every major figure from the heroic period of socialist construction was arrested, tried, and executed for alleged crimes against the state. The trials of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and other prominent revolutionaries shocked the international communist movement while demonstrating Stalin's absolute control over Soviet political life. The purges extended to the military leadership just as the threat of fascist aggression was becoming apparent, as Stalin eliminated 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and thousands of other officers in a paranoid campaign that devastated the Red Army's command structure. The timing of these purges reflected Stalin's belief that internal enemies posed a greater threat than external ones, revealing the degree to which his version of socialism prioritized regime security over national defense. The Soviet Constitution of 1936, known as the Stalin Constitution, proclaimed the achievement of socialism in the Soviet Union, while establishing formal democratic procedures that had little relationship to actual political practice under Stalin's personal dictatorship. The Constitution's guarantees of civil liberties and democratic rights provided propaganda value for international audiences, while masking the reality of comprehensive state control over all aspects of social life. The cult of personality that developed around Stalin during the 1930s transformed the leader into an infallible figure whose theoretical contributions supposedly advanced Marxism-Leninism to new heights of scientific understanding. This personality cult served practical functions in legitimizing policies that departed significantly from Marxist theory, while providing a focal point for loyalty in a system where institutional authority had been systematically undermined through purges and reorganizations. The Comintern, established in 1919 to coordinate international communist movements, became an instrument of Soviet foreign policy under Stalin's leadership rather than an organization dedicated to world revolution. The Popular Front strategy adopted in 1935 reversed previous sectarian policies by encouraging communist parties to ally with social democrats and liberal parties against fascism. But these tactical changes were subordinated to Soviet state interests rather than genuine internationalist principles. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 shocked communists worldwide and exposed the extent to which Stalin was willing to sacrifice ideological consistency for perceived national advantage. As the Soviet Union allied with Nazi Germany and participated in the partition of Poland, while communist parties were forced to abandon anti-fascist positions and support Soviet policy. The pact revealed the degree to which Stalin's socialism had become indistinguishable from traditional great power politics pursued through ideological rhetoric. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 tested Stalin's system under the most extreme conditions, as the Nazi war machine advanced rapidly toward Moscow, Leningrad, and other major cities, while inflicting devastating casualties on Soviet forces unprepared for modern warfare. The initial military disasters revealed the costs of the purges and the limitations of a system that discouraged initiative and independent thinking among military commanders and government officials. The eventual Soviet victory in World War II, achieved at enormous human cost, with an estimated 27 million Soviet deaths, provided retrospective justification for Stalin's industrialization policies, while demonstrating the system's capacity for mass mobilization under extreme pressure. The war effort required temporary relaxation of some repressive policies and greater reliance on patriotic rather than purely ideological appeals, revealing the importance of national sentiment in maintaining popular support for the regime. The post-war reconstruction and expansion of Soviet influence into Eastern Europe established Stalin's model of socialism as the dominant form of communist development, as satellite states adopted similar systems of centralized planning, single-party rule, and rapid industrialization. The establishment of the socialist bloc created a bipolar world order that would define international politics for the remainder of the 20th century. while institutionalizing Stalin's particular interpretation of Marxist theory as orthodox communist doctrine. The announcement of Soviet nuclear capability in 1949 marked the completion of Stalin's transformation of the Soviet Union from a backward agricultural country into a modern industrial and military power, capable of competing with the most advanced capitalist nations, validating his argument that socialism could achieve rapid development through centralized planning and mass mobilization, despite enormous human costs. The brown-shirted paramilitaries marching through Munich's beer halls in November 1923 represented more than just another failed putsch attempt. They embodied a new form of radical politics that would challenge socialism's claim to represent the future of human development by offering an alternative vision of mass mobilization, revolutionary change, and working-class appeal that combined extreme nationalism with pseudo-socialist rhetoric. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party emerged from the economic chaos and political instability of post-war Germany as a movement that consciously positioned itself as the antithesis of Marxist socialism while competing for the same constituencies and employing similar organizational techniques. The fascist response to socialism's growing influence reflected deeper anxieties about modernity, democracy, and social change that the traditional conservative parties seemed unable to address effectively in the aftermath of World War I's devastating impact on European civilization. The Italian Fascist Party, founded by Benito Mussolini in 1919, pioneered the synthesis of revolutionary rhetoric with reactionary goals that would become fascism's defining characteristic, appealing to veterans, middle-class patriots, and displaced workers who felt threatened by both socialist revolution and liberal capitalism's apparent inability to restore national greatness. Mussolini's background as a prominent socialist journalist and theorist before his conversion to extreme nationalism revealed the complex relationship between fascism and socialism, as many fascist leaders had emerged from socialist movements before developing their critique of Marxist internationalism and class analysis. Mussolini's expulsion from the Italian Socialist Party in 1914 for supporting Italian entry into World War I marked his transformation from revolutionary socialist to national revolutionary, but he retained many organizational techniques and rhetorical strategies from his socialist period. The fascist seizure of power in Italy during October 1922 demonstrated the appeal of ultra-nationalist politics in societies where traditional institutions had been discredited by military defeat and economic crisis, as Mussolini's march on Rome succeeded largely because conservative politicians believed they could use fascist energy for their own purposes while maintaining ultimate control. This miscalculation would be repeated across Europe as established elites underestimated fascism's revolutionary potential and overestimated their ability to manipulate fascist movements. The destruction of German democracy during the early 1930s revealed fascism's capacity to exploit economic crisis and political polarization while presenting itself as the only alternative to both communist revolution and liberal democratic weakness. The Nazi Party's electoral breakthrough in September 1930, when it won over 6 million votes and became the second largest party in the Reichstag, reflected the appeal of Hitler's promise to restore German greatness while providing scapegoats for the nation's humiliation and economic suffering. The German Communist Party's sectarian strategy, dictated by Stalin's Comintern line that Social Democrats were social fascists and the main enemy of the working class, prevented effective anti-fascist cooperation and facilitated Nazi success by dividing the left at the crucial moment when united resistance might have prevented Hitler's rise to power. This tragic miscalculation demonstrated how Stalin's foreign policy priorities and theoretical rigidity could undermine socialist movements in other countries. The Nazi seizure of power in January 1933 marked the beginning of the most systematic campaign against socialist and communist organizations in European history, as the new regime moved quickly to destroy trade unions, arrest socialist leaders, and eliminate all independent working-class organizations while establishing concentration camps for political prisoners. The speed and thoroughness of this repression revealed fascism's understanding that socialism represented its most dangerous ideological rival and organizational competitor. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936 when military officers led by Francisco Franco attempted to overthrow the democratically elected Popular Front government, became the defining struggle between fascism and socialism during the 1930s, as competing ideologies fought for the future of European civilization. The conflict attracted international volunteers and material support from across the political spectrum, transforming a Spanish domestic dispute into a rehearsal for the larger European war that would follow. The complex dynamics within the Republican side during the Spanish Civil War revealed the tensions between different socialist tendencies, as Stalinist communists, Trotskyist dissidents, anarcho-syndicalists, and democratic socialists struggled for control while fighting against Franco's fascist-supported rebellion. The Communist Party's systematic elimination of non-Stalinist leftists, including the arrest and murder of Andrei Unin and other POUM leaders, demonstrated how Stalin's version of socialism had become as hostile to alternative socialist visions as to fascist enemies. George Orwell's participation in the Spanish Civil War as a volunteer for the POUM militia provided him with first-hand experience of Stalinist repression that would later inform his critiques of totalitarianism in Animal Farm and 1984, while his homage to Catalonia documented the tragic conflicts within the left that weakened resistance to fascism. Orwell's disillusionment with Stalinist communism reflected broader concerns among democratic socialists about the authoritarian direction of Soviet-influenced movements. The International Brigades, composed of volunteers from over 50 countries who came to Spain to fight fascism, represented the internationalist spirit that had always been central to socialist ideology, demonstrating that working-class solidarity could transcend national boundaries when fundamental principles were at stake. The brigades included communists, socialists, anarchists, and liberal democrats who put aside ideological differences to combat what they recognized as a mortal threat to human freedom and social progress. The eventual Republican defeat in March 1939 resulted from superior fascist military resources, international intervention on Franco's behalf by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and the failure of democratic powers to provide adequate support for the legitimate Spanish government. The conflict's outcome demonstrated fascism's capacity to coordinate international support, while socialist and democratic forces remained divided by ideological disputes and national rivalries. The rise of fascist movements across Europe during the 1930s revealed the limitations of both democratic socialism and Soviet communism in addressing the economic and psychological crises that followed World War I, as millions of Europeans sought alternatives to parliamentary democracy and liberal capitalism that seemed incapable of providing security, prosperity, or national dignity. Fascist movements successfully appealed to middle-class fears of socialist revolution while promising workers national greatness and social improvement without class struggle. The fascist critique of socialism focused particularly on its internationalist character, arguing that class solidarity was artificial compared to the natural bonds of race, nation, and blood that fascists claimed should organize human society. This nationalist appeal proved effective among workers who felt that socialist parties were more concerned with abstract theoretical principles than with defending national interests and cultural traditions against foreign influence and immigration. The economic policies implemented by fascist regimes represented a third way between socialist planning and capitalist markets that appealed to those who wanted economic modernization without social revolution, as fascist governments maintained private property while directing economic activity toward national goals through extensive state intervention. This model appeared to combine the efficiency of capitalism with the social purpose of socialism while avoiding both class conflict and international dependence. The rearmament programs undertaken by fascist regimes provided short-term economic benefits that enhanced their popular support while preparing for the aggressive wars that were central to fascist ideology, demonstrating how militarization could serve both economic and political functions in societies seeking alternatives to democratic socialism and liberal capitalism. The apparent success of fascist economic policies during the 1930s influenced debates about the relationship between democracy and economic planning that would continue throughout the 20th century. The Anti-Comintern Pact, signed by Germany and Japan in November 1936, later joined by Italy and other fascist-aligned countries, formalized the ideological alliance against international communism while preparing for the global conflict that fascist leaders viewed as inevitable and necessary for achieving their revolutionary goals. This alliance demonstrated that fascism had developed its own international organization to compete with socialist internationalism. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, which sacrificed Czechoslovak independence to appease Nazi expansion, revealed the failure of democratic powers to understand fascism's revolutionary character and unlimited ambitions, as British and French leaders hoped that territorial concessions would satisfy Hitler's demands and preserve peace. This appeasement policy reflected the democratic powers' fear of both fascist aggression and communist revolution, leading them to miscalculate the nature of the threat they faced. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 shocked the world by uniting the two most bitter ideological enemies in a temporary alliance that enabled the German invasion of Poland and the beginning of World War II, demonstrating that both fascist and communist regimes were willing to sacrifice ideological consistency for perceived strategic advantage. The pact's collapse with the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 would transform the global conflict into a struggle between competing visions of modernity and social organization that would determine the post-war world order. The massive red flag that unfurled over the ruins of Berlin's Reichstag in May 1945 carried more than just the symbol of Soviet victory. It announced the beginning of socialism's greatest territorial expansion in human history, as the Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe created the opportunity to establish communist governments across a vast region stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans. The post-war settlement would transform nearly half of Europe into socialist states, while simultaneously witnessing the triumph of communist revolution in the world's most populous country, fundamentally altering the global balance of power and creating a bipolar world divided between competing social systems. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 revealed the complex negotiations between the Allied powers over post-war arrangements, as Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill attempted to balance their nation's strategic interests with their conflicting visions of European reconstruction and democratic governance. Stalin's insistence on friendly governments in Eastern Europe reflected both legitimate security concerns about preventing future German aggression and his determination to extend Soviet influence through the establishment of communist-dominated regimes that would serve as a buffer zone against Western capitalism. The process of socialist transformation in Eastern Europe varied significantly between countries, depending on local conditions, the strength of indigenous communist movements, and the degree of Soviet control established during the war's final phases. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito's partisan movement had liberated much of the country through its own military efforts, providing a basis for independent communist development that would later lead to conflict with Stalin's desire for uniform control over the socialist bloc. Poland's tragic experience revealed the contradictions inherent in imposing socialist transformation on societies where communist parties lacked substantial popular support, as the Soviet-backed government struggled to legitimize itself against the legacy of the London-based government in exile and the memory of Soviet complicity in the country's 1939 partition. The Warsaw Uprising's brutal suppression, while Soviet forces waited outside the city, demonstrated the political calculations that influenced military strategy during the war's final phase. Czechoslovakia's communist takeover in February 1948 marked the completion of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, as the last democratic government in the region was eliminated through a combination of political manipulation, mass demonstrations, and the threat of Soviet intervention. The coup's success reflected both the Communist Party's organizational advantages and the Democratic Party's inability to address the economic and social problems that the war had created throughout Central Europe. The establishment of Comecon in January 1949 created an alternative economic system designed to integrate the socialist countries under Soviet leadership while reducing their dependence on trade with Western capitalist nations. The organization's emphasis on industrial development and resource sharing reflected Stalin's vision of socialist economic cooperation, but it also served to bind the Eastern European countries more closely to Soviet economic and political control. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 demonstrated the extent to which the former wartime allies had become adversaries, as Stalin attempted to force Western withdrawal from Berlin through economic pressure, while the Western powers responded with the massive airlift that sustained the city's population and affirmed their commitment to maintaining a presence in Germany. The crisis marked the formal beginning of the Cold War as a global confrontation between socialist and capitalist systems. Meanwhile, in China, Mao Zedong was developing a revolutionary strategy that would prove even more significant for socialism's global expansion than the Soviet victories in Europe, as his adaptation of Marxist theory to Chinese conditions created a model for peasant-based revolution that would influence liberation movements throughout the developing world. Mao's theoretical innovations challenged orthodox Marxist assumptions about the working class as the sole revolutionary agent, while demonstrating that socialist revolution could succeed in predominantly agricultural societies. The Chinese Communist Party's Long March of 1934 to 1935 had established Mao's leadership while providing crucial experience in guerrilla warfare and peasant organizing that would prove decisive during the subsequent war against Japan and the civil war with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. The march's legendary status in Chinese communist mythology reflected its importance in forging the party's identity as a disciplined revolutionary organization capable of extraordinary sacrifice for long-term goals. Mao's strategy of People's War emphasized the revolutionary potential of China's vast peasant population while developing military tactics appropriate for a weak insurgent force confronting better-equipped conventional armies. The theory of protracted struggle through rural base areas represented a fundamental departure from orthodox Marxist expectations about urban working-class revolution, but it proved remarkably effective in Chinese conditions, where the overwhelming majority of the population lived in rural areas under semi-feudal conditions. The Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945 provided the Chinese Communist Party with opportunities to expand its influence while positioning itself as the most effective defender of Chinese national interests against foreign aggression. The party's emphasis on guerrilla warfare and mass mobilization proved superior to the nationalist strategy of conventional military resistance, allowing the communists to build extensive rural support networks while the nationalists' forces were weakened by prolonged fighting against Japanese occupation. The resumption of civil war in 1946 revealed the extent to which the Communist Nationalist United Front against Japan had been a temporary alliance that concealed fundamental disagreements about China's political and social future. The Communist Party's land reform program, which redistributed property from landlords to peasants, provided a material basis for rural support that the nationalist government could not match, despite superior equipment and initial military advantages. The People's Liberation Army's stunning victories during 1948 and 1949 demonstrated the effectiveness of Mao's revolutionary strategy as communist forces advanced rapidly from their rural strongholds to capture major cities and defeat nationalist armies that had seemed far superior in conventional military terms. The speed of the nationalist collapse reflected not just military defeats but the government's complete loss of popular legitimacy due to corruption, inflation, and failure to address China's fundamental social problems. The proclamation of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, marked the triumph of the world's largest communist revolution and fundamentally altered the global balance of power by bringing nearly 1/4 of humanity under socialist governance. Mao's victory demonstrated that Marxist analysis could be successfully adapted to conditions very different from those Marx had originally envisioned, expanding socialism's appeal to peasant societies throughout the developing world. The Chinese Revolution's international impact extended far beyond its immediate borders, as Mao's success inspired liberation movements in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, while providing an alternative model of socialist development that emphasized rural transformation and cultural revolution rather than primarily industrial modernization. The emergence of a second major communist power also created tensions within the international socialist movement that would eventually lead to the Sino-Soviet split. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950 when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, became the first major military confrontation of the Cold War era and tested the solidarity between the Soviet Union and the new Chinese Communist government. China's decision to intervene when United Nations forces approached the Chinese border demonstrated the new regime's willingness to sacrifice enormously for strategic objectives and ideological commitments. The establishment of the German Democratic Republic in October 1949 completed the division of Europe into competing social systems, as the Soviet zone of occupation became a socialist state that would serve as a showcase for communist development in the heart of Europe. The GDR's creation formalized the Cold War division of Germany, while providing the socialist bloc with a strategic outpost in Western Europe. The death of Stalin in March 1953 created opportunities for new developments within the socialist world, as his successors grappled with the legacy of his repressive policies while attempting to maintain the unity and expansion of the communist movement. The East German uprising in June 1953 and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 revealed the tensions between Soviet control and popular aspirations for greater freedom within the socialist countries. The Bandung Conference of 1955 brought together leaders from 29 Asian and African countries, many of them newly independent from colonial rule, to discuss cooperation and non-alignment in the Cold War struggle between socialist and capitalist powers. The conference's emphasis on anti-imperialism and economic development provided opportunities for socialist countries to extend their influence among developing nations seeking alternatives to Western capitalism. By the mid-1950s, socialism had achieved a global presence that would have been unimaginable to Marx and Engels a century earlier. As communist governments controlled vast territories from Eastern Europe to East Asia, while socialist parties and liberation movements operated on every continent, creating a bipolar world order that would define international politics for the remainder of the 20th century. The towering concrete barrier that divided Berlin from August 1961 symbolized more than just the physical separation of East and West. It embodied the fundamental ideological chasm that had emerged between competing visions of human development, economic organization, and social progress that would define global politics for nearly half a century. The Cold War transformed socialism from a revolutionary movement seeking to overthrow capitalism into one pole of a bipolar world order, where nuclear weapons made direct military confrontation between the superpowers unthinkable, forcing the ideological struggle into proxy conflicts, economic competition, and battles for influence among newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947, formally committed the United States to containing communist expansion worldwide while providing economic and military assistance to governments threatened by socialist movements, fundamentally altering American foreign policy from its traditional isolationism to global engagement in defense of capitalist democracy. President Harry Truman's declaration that the world faced a choice between alternative ways of life framed the Cold War as an existential struggle between freedom and tyranny that would justify massive military expenditures and interventions in distant countries. The Marshall Plan, launched in June 1947 with an initial commitment of over $13 billion for European reconstruction, represented the most ambitious economic assistance program in history, while serving strategic purposes in strengthening Western European economies against communist appeal and integrating them into an American-led capitalist system. The plan's success in restoring European prosperity demonstrated capitalism's capacity for international cooperation and enlightened self-interest that contrasted sharply with Soviet exploitation of Eastern Europe. The formation of NATO in April 1949 created the military alliance that would serve as the institutional framework for Western resistance to Soviet expansion, while the Warsaw Pact's establishment in 1955 provided the Socialist bloc with its own collective security organization. These competing alliances institutionalized the division of Europe while extending the Cold War's military dimension to encompass the possibility of global nuclear warfare that could destroy human civilization. The development of nuclear weapons by both superpowers created a balance of terror that paradoxically reduced the likelihood of direct military confrontation while intensifying competition in other spheres, as leaders on both sides recognized that nuclear war would be catastrophic for their own societies, regardless of ideological commitments. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction forced the Cold War into channels of economic competition, technological rivalry, and proxy conflicts in the developing world. The Hungarian Revolution of October 1956 revealed both the appeal of democratic socialism and the limitations of Soviet tolerance for diversity within the socialist bloc, as Hungarian workers and students demanded political reforms and national independence that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Stalinist control. The brutal Soviet suppression of the uprising, which killed thousands of Hungarians and forced hundreds of thousands to flee as refugees, demonstrated that the socialist bloc's unity depended ultimately on military force rather than ideological conviction. The simultaneous Suez Crisis exposed the declining influence of traditional European colonial powers, while highlighting the superpowers' shared interest in preventing regional conflicts from escalating into global confrontation, as both the United States and Soviet Union opposed the British, French, Israeli intervention against Egypt. The crisis marked a turning point in Cold War dynamics by demonstrating that ideological competition would increasingly focus on the developing world rather than Europe. The launch of Sputnik in October 1957 shocked the Western world by demonstrating Soviet technological capabilities that seemed to validate claims about socialism's superior capacity for rapid modernization and scientific advancement. The space race that followed became a crucial arena for Cold War competition, as both superpowers invested enormous resources in demonstrating their system's technological superiority through achievements in space exploration that captured global imagination. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 brought socialism to the Western Hemisphere for the first time, while creating a strategic challenge for the United States that would test the limits of Cold War competition in America's traditional sphere of influence. Fidel Castro's transformation from nationalist revolutionary to Marxist-Leninist leader reflected the complex dynamics through which anti-imperialist movements in the developing world gravitated towards socialism as the most effective ideology for challenging Western domination. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war, while demonstrating both the intensity of Cold War competition and the ultimate constraints that mutual vulnerability imposed on both sides. The peaceful resolution of the missile crisis marked a turning point toward more cautious management of superpower relations, though ideological competition continued unabated in other arenas. Meanwhile, democratic socialist parties in Western Europe were developing alternative models that combined market economies with extensive social welfare systems, demonstrating that socialist values could be pursued through parliamentary democracy rather than revolutionary transformation. The British Labour Party's creation of the National Health Service in 1948 represented a landmark achievement in democratic socialism that provided universal healthcare while maintaining democratic institutions and mixed economic systems. The Swedish Social Democratic Party's long dominance from 1932 to 1976 created what became known as the Swedish model of democratic socialism, featuring high levels of social welfare, income equality, and labor union influence within a market economy that achieved both prosperity and social solidarity. The Swedish approach influenced socialist parties throughout Europe, while providing evidence that extensive social programs were compatible with economic growth and democratic governance. The West German Social Democratic Party's adoption of the Bad Godesberg program in 1959 marked a decisive shift toward democratic socialism that abandoned Marxist orthodoxy in favor of pragmatic reform, policies designed to appeal to middle-class voters as well as traditional working-class constituencies. The SPD's transformation reflected broader trends among European socialist parties toward moderation and acceptance of market economies with strong social welfare components. The Prague Spring of 1968 represented the most serious challenge to Soviet control since the Hungarian Revolution, as Czechoslovak communists led by Alexander Dubček attempted to create socialism with a human face that would combine economic reform with political liberalization and cultural freedom. The Warsaw Pact invasion that crushed the reform movement demonstrated the Soviet Union's determination to prevent any deviation from orthodox communist governance within its sphere of influence. The student movements that erupted across Western Europe and the United States during 1968 reflected a generational revolt against both capitalist consumerism and bureaucratic socialism, as young activists sought more participatory and egalitarian forms of social organization that challenged authority in all its forms. The New Left's emphasis on cultural revolution and lifestyle politics expanded socialist concerns beyond traditional economic issues to encompass questions of personal liberation and social transformation. The Vietnam War became the defining conflict of the Cold War era for a generation of Western leftists who saw American intervention as emblematic of capitalist imperialism's destructive impact on the developing world, while the North Vietnamese struggle represented heroic resistance to Western domination. The war's ultimate outcome, with communist victory despite massive American military intervention, seemed to validate claims about socialism's appeal among oppressed peoples worldwide. The Chilean election of Salvador Allende in 1970 marked the first time a Marxist had been democratically elected president in the Western Hemisphere, creating hopes among democratic socialists that parliamentary methods could achieve socialist transformation even in countries dominated by capitalist elites. Allende's popular unity government implemented extensive nationalization and land reform while maintaining democratic institutions and civil liberties. The military takeover that overthrew Allende in September 1973, with covert American support, demonstrated the limits of democratic socialism in societies where conservative elites retained control of military and economic institutions. General Augusto Pinochet's brutal authoritarian regime, aligned with communism, eliminated Chilean democracy while implementing free market economic policies that became a model for neoliberal reforms throughout Latin America. The Portuguese Revolution of April 1974 and Spain's transition to democracy following Franco's death in 1975 provided more successful examples of democratic socialist participation in post-authoritarian transitions, as socialist parties played crucial roles in consolidating democratic institutions while avoiding the polarization that had destroyed Chilean democracy. These experiences influenced socialist strategy throughout Southern Europe and Latin America. The Euro-communist movement of the 1970s represented an attempt by Western European communist parties to develop democratic alternatives to Soviet-style socialism while maintaining Marxist analysis and revolutionary goals. The Italian, French, and Spanish communist parties' embrace of parliamentary democracy and pluralism challenged Soviet leadership of the international communist movement while offering potential bridges between communist and social democratic Traditions. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 marked the beginning of the final phase of the Cold War, as the costly and ultimately unsuccessful intervention weakened the Soviet system while providing the United States with an opportunity to support Islamic resistance that would have profound long-term consequences for global politics. The war's drain on Soviet resources coincided with deepening economic problems that would ultimately contribute to the socialist system's collapse. The hammer and sickle flag that flew over the Kremlin for the last time on December 25, 1991, marked not just the end of the Soviet Union, but the conclusion of the 20th century's grand experiment in socialist transformation, forcing socialist movements worldwide to confront the apparent failure of their most powerful example and to reimagine socialism's future in a world where capitalist triumphalism seemed to herald the end of history. The collapse of European communism within the span of 2 years, from the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 to the dissolution of the USSR itself, created a crisis of confidence among socialists that would require decades to overcome, while opening space for new forms of socialist thought and practice adapted to 21st century conditions. Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in March 1985 had initiated the reforms of glasnost and perestroika that were intended to revitalize Soviet socialism through greater openness and economic restructuring. But these well-intentioned efforts unleashed forces that ultimately destroyed the system they were meant to save. Gorbachev's recognition that the Soviet economy was stagnating and that the arms race with the United States was unsustainable led him to pursue nuclear disarmament and political reform that reduced international tensions while inadvertently weakening the Communist Party's monopoly on power. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster of April 1986 became a powerful symbol of Soviet system failure, as the initial cover-up attempts and subsequent revelations of safety violations demonstrated the incompetence and dishonesty that had characterized Soviet governance for decades. The accident's environmental and health consequences discredited claims about socialist technological superiority, while galvanizing opposition movements that demanded greater accountability and democratic participation in government decision-making. The revolutions of 1989 swept across Eastern Europe with stunning rapidity, as populations that had endured 4 decades of communist rule seized opportunities created by Gorbachev's renunciation of the Brezhnev Doctrine and his refusal to use military force to maintain Soviet control over satellite states. The Solidarity movement's electoral victory in Poland, the peaceful overthrow of communist governments in Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, and the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall demonstrated the bankruptcy of imposed socialism and the power of popular movements demanding democratic governance. The Romanian Revolution's violent conclusion, which resulted in the permanent sleep of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife on Christmas Day 1989, provided a brutal coda to the communist era in Eastern Europe, while highlighting the extent to which some communist leaders had lost all connection to the socialist ideals they claimed to represent. The Ceausescu regime's combination of megalomania, corruption, and repression had created conditions that made violent revolution almost inevitable once the possibility of change emerged. The German reunification process that followed the Berlin Wall's fall created enormous challenges for integrating 2 very different economic and political systems. As East Germans experienced both the liberation of democratic participation and the trauma of economic displacement, when inefficient socialist enterprises collapsed under competitive pressure. The reunification's costs and complications provided sobering lessons about the difficulties of transitioning from socialist to capitalist systems, even under the most favorable circumstances. Boris Yeltsin's emergence as the leader of Russian democracy during the failed August 1991 takeover attempt marked the final phase of Soviet collapse, as his defiance of the hardliners who sought to reverse Gorbachev's reforms galvanized popular resistance that ultimately led to the Communist Party's dissolution and the USSR's replacement by independent republics. Yeltsin's subsequent economic policies, which embraced radical free market reforms designed by Western advisors, created massive social disruption and economic inequality that many Russians came to associate with democracy itself. The post-communist transitions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union revealed the complexity of building democratic institutions and market economies in societies where civil society had been suppressed and where populations lacked experience with pluralistic politics and competitive economics. The varying success of different countries in managing these transitions, from the relative prosperity of Poland and the Czech Republic to the struggles of Ukraine and the authoritarian regression in Russia, demonstrated that institutional design and leadership quality were crucial factors in determining outcomes. China's survival of the communist collapse through economic liberalization, while maintaining Communist Party political control, provided an alternative model that challenged assumptions about the necessary connection between market economies and democratic governance. Deng Xiaoping's socialist market economy reforms had begun in the late 1970s and accelerated after the Chinese tank guy protests of 1989, creating unprecedented economic growth while avoiding the political liberalization that had destroyed European communist regimes. The Chinese model's success in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty while maintaining social stability influenced debates about development strategies throughout the global South, as many countries sought to emulate China's combination of authoritarian governance with market-oriented economics. This Beijing consensus provided an alternative to the Washington consensus of free market policies that had often failed to deliver promised benefits in developing countries. Meanwhile, democratic socialist parties in Western Europe were adapting to the post-Cold War environment by embracing third-way politics that sought to combine market efficiency with social democratic values, as leaders like Tony Blair in Britain and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany moved their parties toward the center to appeal to middle-class voters who had prospered under capitalism but still supported strong social welfare systems. The emergence of 21st century socialism in Latin America during the early 2000s represented the most significant attempt to revive socialist politics in the post-Soviet era, as leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador implemented policies designed to reduce inequality and expand social services while maintaining democratic institutions and mixed economies. These experiments drew on the region's experience with neoliberalism's failures while seeking to avoid the authoritarian excesses that had discredited 20th century socialism. Chavez's Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, launched after his election in 1998, combined extensive social programs funded by oil revenues with increasingly authoritarian governance that polarized Venezuelan society and created economic instability that ultimately led to political crisis and mass emigration. The Venezuelan experience demonstrated both the appeal of socialist policies for addressing inequality and the dangers of concentrating power in charismatic leaders without strong institutional constraints. The global financial crisis of 2008 created new opportunities for socialist criticism of capitalism while highlighting the continued relevance of Marxist analysis of capitalist instability and inequality, as the crisis revealed the extent to which deregulation and financialization had created systemic risks that threatened the entire global economy. The crisis's aftermath, which saw massive bailouts for financial institutions while ordinary workers faced unemployment and austerity measures, generated renewed interest in socialist alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. The Occupy Wall Street movement that emerged in 2011 expressed popular anger about economic inequality and corporate power, while reviving socialist themes about class conflict and systemic transformation. Though the movement's horizontal organization and consensus decision-making reflected anarchist influences rather than traditional socialist emphasis on party organization and electoral strategy. The movement's slogan about the 99% versus the 1% provided a framework for understanding contemporary class relations that influenced subsequent political developments. Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020 marked the emergence of democratic socialism as a significant force in mainstream American politics for the first time since the early 20th century, as the Vermont senator's advocacy for universal health care, free college education, and wealth taxes attracted millions of supporters, particularly among young Americans who had experienced economic insecurity despite high levels of education and productivity. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's election to Congress in 2018 and her subsequent prominence as a spokesperson for democratic socialist policies demonstrated the appeal of socialist ideas among younger Americans who had witnessed capitalism's failures during the financial crisis and climate change, while facing unprecedented levels of student debt and housing costs that made traditional middle-class prosperity increasingly unattainable. The Nordic model of social democracy continued to attract international attention, as countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway demonstrated that extensive welfare states and high levels of economic equality were compatible with prosperity and innovation in the global economy, providing contemporary examples of successful democratic socialist policies that challenged neoliberal claims about the necessity of inequality for economic growth. The climate crisis that became increasingly urgent during the early 21st century created new imperatives for socialist politics, as environmental activists argued that addressing global warming required fundamental challenges to capitalist growth imperatives and consumption patterns that democratic socialist policies of carbon pricing, renewable energy investment, and economic planning could help address more effectively than market-based solutions alone. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 highlighted both the importance of strong public health systems and social welfare programs, while demonstrating the essential role of government intervention in managing economic and health crises, as countries with more robust social democratic institutions generally performed better in protecting both public health and economic security during the crisis. The pandemic's disproportionate impact on working-class communities and racial minorities reinforced socialist arguments about the connection between economic inequality and social vulnerability. As socialism enters its third century as a political movement, it faces the challenge of developing new forms of organization and policy that can address 21st century problems of inequality, environmental degradation, and technological disruption, while learning from both the achievements and failures of previous socialist experiments. The movement's future will likely depend on its ability to combine the moral vision that has always motivated socialist politics with practical policies that can improve people's lives within democratic institutions, while pointing toward more fundamental transformations of economic and social relationships that remain capitalism's enduring legacy of exploitation and environmental destruction.